The silent watcher. The wind carried a soft chill through the quiet countryside, rustling the golden fields and whispering against the walls of an old wooden house. The porch creaked slightly under the weight of the large golden retriever, who sat motionless on the top step, his deep brown eyes fixed on the dusty road beyond the gate. The early morning mist curled around the fence posts, wrapping the world in a soft golden haze as the first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon. The dog, known to the villagers as Bailey, had sat in that same spot every single day for 2 years. He did not bark at passing cars. He did not chase after birds. He did not move, except for the occasional flick of his ears as the wind carried the sound of footsteps or the distant hum of an engine. His focus remained locked on the road, as if waiting for someone only he could see. Nobody in the village knew exactly why Bailey waited there, but they all had their suspicions. Some believed it was simply habit, an old dog set in his ways. Others whispered that it was something deeper, something only a heart as loyal as his could understand. But those who had lived in the village long enough knew the truth. Bailey was waiting for his master, a bond forged in loyalty. 2 years earlier, that same porch had been filled with laughter. The sound of boots stepping onto the wooden steps was a familiar rhythm, always followed by a warm hand scratching behind Bailey's ears. His master, Captain James Turner, had raised Bailey from a pup, training him with patience and love. James had always been a man of strong discipline, but he had a soft spot for the golden retriever who followed him everywhere. They had shared countless moments together. Morning runs through the fields, lazy afternoons in the shade of the old oak tree, and quiet evenings on the porch where James would rest his hand on Bailey's back as they watched the sun dip below the hills. But then came the day when everything changed. A letter arrived in the mail. A letter that bore the seal of the military, crisp and official. Bailey didn't understand the words, but he sensed the shift in James's mood. The excitement in his voice turned into quiet contemplation. The long walks became shorter. The training sessions became more intense. And then, one evening, James sat down beside Bailey, his hand resting on the retriever's head. His touch was gentle, but his voice was heavy. "I have to go, buddy," he whispered, his fingers running through Bailey's thick fur. "Just for a little while. But I'll come back. I promise." Bailey whined softly, his tail wagging weakly, as if trying to reassure his master. He didn't fully understand, but he could feel the weight in James's voice. The next morning, as the first light stretched across the sky, James packed his bag. Bailey lay by his boots, refusing to move. He nudged his master's leg with his nose, trying to stop him, trying to understand why he was leaving. James knelt beside him. "You have to stay here, okay? Keep the house safe. I'll be back before you know it." Bailey licked his hand, his tail thumping once against the wooden floor. Then James stood, slung his bag over his shoulder, and walked toward the waiting car. Bailey followed. At first it was just a few cautious steps. Then, as the car door closed and the engine roared to life, he ran. His paws pounded against the dirt road, his heart racing. He chased after the car, his barks desperate, his legs straining to keep up. But the car grew smaller and smaller until it was just a speck on the horizon. And then it was gone. Bailey stood in the middle of the empty road, panting heavily, his chest rising and falling with each breath. His ears drooped, his tail lowered, but still, he didn't turn back. He waited. And when the sun began to set, he climbed the small hill near the house, the one with the perfect view of the road, and sat there, watching. A routine of hope. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And yet, Bailey never stopped waiting. Each morning, as the sun rose, he would walk to the top of the hill and sit there, his eyes scanning the road. He would stay for hours, only moving when hunger or exhaustion forced him to return to the house. The villagers took notice. At first, they thought it was just temporary, that Bailey would grow tired of waiting and move on. But as the seasons changed, and Bailey's routine remained unbroken, they began to understand. The old man from the general store started leaving food out for him. A young boy who passed by on his way to school would stop and talk to him, telling him stories about his day. An elderly woman, who had lost her own husband to war decades ago, would leave a bowl of water on her porch, whispering to herself, "He's waiting for his best friend." But no matter how much kindness the village showed him, Bailey remained distant. He never wagged his tail when strangers approached. He never left the porch unless it was to go to the hill. Because in his heart, Bailey believed one thing: James was coming back. A lonely winter. The first year was the hardest. Winter came, and the snow fell heavy, covering the fields in a thick white blanket. The villagers worried about Bailey, afraid that he wouldn't survive the cold. They tried to bring him inside, to give him shelter, but he refused. Instead, he would curl up on the porch, his body shivering but his spirit unbroken. Some nights, when the wind howled through the trees, he would let out a soft whimper, a sound of longing, of loneliness. But still he waited. And when spring came and the snow melted away, Bailey climbed the hill once more, his tail wagging slightly at the sight of the open road. He believed. He believed with every fiber of his being that one day James would return. That the sound of boots would once again echo on the porch. That the warm, familiar hand would scratch behind his ears. That the promise made long ago would finally be fulfilled. So he waited, day after day. As the sun rose and set, as the seasons changed, as time moved forward, Bailey stayed. Because some promises, he believed, were never broken. Seasons of waiting. The seasons passed like whispers through the hills. Spring arrived, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth and blooming wildflowers. The village awakened with color, yet Bailey remained the same, perched on the hilltop, his golden fur catching the breeze, his deep brown eyes locked onto the road stretching into the distance. He had not forgotten. Every morning, as the sun broke free from the horizon, Bailey would rise from the porch and make the slow trek up the hill. His movements were steady, deliberate. He knew the path by heart. The small divots in the earth where his paws had pressed down 1,000 times, the stones he had stepped over since the very first day James left. Bailey's waiting had become a familiar sight to the villagers. At first, they had pitied him, but over time, their feelings changed. It wasn't just sorrow they felt for the dog who refused to leave. It was admiration. The village's guardian. One by one, the villagers became a part of Bailey's quiet vigil. An elderly woman named Mrs. Porter, who had lost her husband to war many years before, began leaving out a bowl of warm food each morning at the foot of the hill. A young boy, Tommy, who passed by on his way to school, stopped to sit beside Bailey on the days when he was feeling lonely. "My dad's away too," he whispered once, rubbing Bailey's ear, "but my mom says he'll be back soon." Bailey blinked but did not move. He had learned that words were different from actions, that waiting was more than just hearing promises, it was believing in them. The old shopkeeper, Mr. Caldwell, had once tried to take Bailey in on a stormy night, leading him toward the warmth of his fireplace, but Bailey had refused. No matter how cold the nights became, no matter how the wind howled through the trees, he always returned to his spot, his place. The villagers began to say that Bailey wasn't just waiting for James anymore. He was protecting something. A memory, a bond, a love that time itself could not shake. A distant scent. One crisp autumn morning, a car pulled into the village. The hum of its engine was unfamiliar, its tires kicking up small puffs of dust as it rolled slowly down the main road. Bailey, resting on the hill, lifted his head. The scent was new, yet something about it made his ears twitch. It wasn't James, but it carried traces of him. Faint, almost forgotten. A man stepped out of the car, his movements careful, as though the weight of something unseen pressed against his shoulders. He was older, his face lined with years of experience, and he carried himself like someone who had walked many difficult roads. Sergeant Daniel Miller. He was a soldier, just like James, and he had come with news. Miller had heard stories of Bailey from one of his comrades who had passed through the village months ago. A dog who waited, the dog who never left, a dog whose heart refused to let go. The tale had unsettled Miller, stirring something deep within him. Because he knew the truth. He had fought alongside James, had seen the strength in his eyes, the determination in his voice, had heard him speak of home, of the dog he had left behind, the friend he had sworn to return to. Miller knew what Bailey did not. James was never coming home. The soldier and the dog. Miller hesitated before approaching the hill. He knew the moment would be painful. He had delivered news like this before, to families, to friends, but never to a dog. How could he explain something like this? How could he tell Bailey the truth in a way he would understand? As he climbed the hill, Bailey's body stiffened. The scent. It was stronger now. Bailey stood, his eyes locked onto the approaching figure. His heart pounded. Something about the way the man moved, the way he carried himself, it was familiar. Not James, but something connected to him. Miller stopped a few feet away and crouched down, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out something small, something worn with time. A military dog tag. James's dog tag. Bailey's eyes flickered between the man and the small piece of metal in his hand. Miller swallowed hard. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft. He loved you, you know. Bailey tilted his head, his body tense. Miller exhaled. James talked about you all the time. Said you were the best partner he ever had. His fingers tightened around the dog tag. He wanted to come home to you, more than anything. Bailey's ears twitched at the sound of his master's name. Miller sighed, looking at the vast open road in front of them. But he didn't make it back. The words hung heavy in the air. Bailey didn't move. He didn't whine, didn't bark. He only stared, his amber eyes searching Miller's face as if trying to find something. Anything that would contradict what he had just heard. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, Miller extended the dog tag toward Bailey. He carried this with him, every day. Bailey sniffed the tag, his breath shaky. Then, something shifted. A soft whimper, barely audible, escaped his throat. And then another. And another. Miller clenched his jaw, his own heart aching at the sound. He reached out a hand, hesitated, then rested it gently on Bailey's back. I know, he whispered. I miss him too. Bailey let out a long, slow breath, and for the first time in 2 years, he turned away from the road. The first step forward. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills and painted the sky in soft shades of gold and crimson, Bailey did something he had never done before. He walked down the hill with Miller. The villagers watched in quiet awe as the old retriever, who had spent so long frozen in time, finally moved towards something new. It wasn't a replacement for what was lost. It wasn't a surrender. It was a choice to carry James's memory forward, rather than remain trapped in a moment that had already passed. As they reached the bottom of the hill, Miller gently placed the dog tag around Bailey's neck. It hung there, a small yet powerful reminder of the bond that could never be broken. Bailey looked up at him, his tail giving the smallest, hesitant wag. Miller smiled. Come on, buddy. Let's go home. Bailey took one last glance at the road. Then he followed. Because some journeys don't end. They simply change. A new path to walk. The village had grown used to the sight of Bailey perched on the hill, his watchful eyes fixed on the distant road. But after that evening, after Sergeant Miller had come and spoken to him, after Bailey had walked away from his usual place for the first time in 2 years, something in the town changed. Whispers passed between the villagers. Some wiped away quiet tears, knowing the weight of what had happened. Others watched Bailey with silent admiration, understanding that his grief had not vanished but had begun to shift, to reshape itself into something else. And for the first time in a long time, the golden retriever no longer sat alone. Footsteps beside him. Miller returned the next morning, standing on the edge of the hill where Bailey had once kept his unwavering vigil. He didn't try to coax the dog down or call him away. He simply sat beside him, watching the same road Bailey had watched for years. Bailey didn't leave his spot right away. His heart still clung to old routines, old hopes. But there was something different now. He was no longer waiting in solitude. The two sat in silence, the wind rustling the dry grass around them. Miller reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a photograph, worn at the edges. He placed it on the ground between them. It was James. James in his uniform, standing beside a younger Bailey, his arm draped around the retriever's back as he smiled into the camera. Bailey's ears twitched. He leaned forward, his wet nose gently pressing against the picture. Miller sighed. He carried this with him, kept it in his pocket. Bailey didn't move, but his breath shuddered slightly. Miller's voice was steady but filled with quiet emotion. James used to say that no matter where he was in the world, he knew you were waiting for him. That thought got him through some of the worst nights. Bailey turned his head slightly, as if listening. Miller hesitated before speaking again. I think, in some way, he's still with you. With us. He reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before resting gently on Bailey's back. And I think he'd want you to live, Bailey. Not just wait. Bailey closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into the touch. For the first time in years, he wasn't just hearing words. He was understanding them. Finding purpose again. The days that followed were different. Bailey still climbed the hill every morning, but now, he didn't stay as long. Instead of waiting for hours, he would sit for a while, then follow Miller back down. The villagers began to see him wandering through town more often, his golden coat catching the morning light as he padded alongside the soldier who had become his new companion. He still carried James's memory with him. He always would, but now his steps were lighter. Miller, too, found a strange kind of comfort in Bailey's presence. At first, he hadn't known what to do with himself. He had returned to this village with a weight on his shoulders, unsure of how to let go of the ghosts that followed him. But Bailey's quiet companionship helped in ways he never expected. They developed a new routine, one that didn't erase the past, but allowed them both to move forward. Each morning, they walked through the fields together, Miller talking softly about the stories James had told him during the war. Bailey listened, his ears perking up at the sound of his master's name. In the afternoons, they visited the town square, where children would stop to pet Bailey, their laughter filling the air. And in the evenings, they would return to the porch, the same porch where James and Bailey had once sat together. Miller would rest in the old wooden chair, sipping coffee, while Bailey curled up at his feet. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. The letter. One evening, as Miller was sorting through an old box of his belongings, he found something he had forgotten he carried. A letter. Not just any letter, one from James, written during his final days on deployment. Miller's hands trembled as he unfolded it, his heart tightening at the familiar handwriting. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back. Miller swallowed hard, his throat dry. Take care of Bailey for me, will you? He's not just a dog. He's family. And if I'm not there, he's going to need someone to remind him that he's still loved. Miller closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Bailey, who had been resting beside him, lifted his head as if sensing the weight of the moment. Miller reached down, scratching behind his ears. You were never just a dog to him, he whispered. And you're not just a dog to me either. Bailey wagged his tail, just a small, hesitant wag, but a sign that he understood. Miller folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box. Tomorrow, he decided, he would take Bailey somewhere new, somewhere they hadn't been before. Because James was right. Bailey wasn't just a dog. He was a friend, a protector, a piece of something that would never truly be lost. And together, they would carry James's memory forward, not just by remembering, but by living. The promise that lies on. The morning was different. There was something in the air, not sadness, not longing, but something else, something lighter. Bailey had still climbed the hill that day, his golden fur catching the soft morning sunlight as he gazed down the long, empty road. But unlike the other times, he did not sit for long. Miller stood a few steps behind him, hands in his pockets, waiting. "Ready, boy?" he asked gently. Bailey's ears twitched at the familiar voice. For the first time in 2 years, he turned away from the road with no hesitation. And then he followed. A journey together. Miller had made a promise to James, to Bailey, and in some ways, to himself. He had spent too long carrying the weight of the past, stuck between guilt and grief. But watching Bailey learn to move forward had taught him something. Remembering wasn't about standing still. It was about carrying love forward, about honoring what had been without being trapped by it. So that morning, they didn't go to the hill. Instead, they walked to the river, the place James had taken Bailey as a pup, where they had spent lazy afternoons in the sun. Bailey's steps were light as he padded along the grassy bank. He sniffed at the air, his tail wagging slightly. The water shimmered in the early light, reflecting the sky like a perfect mirror. Miller sat down on a rock, watching as Bailey stepped to the river's edge, dipping his nose into the cool water. It was peaceful. For the first time in years, Bailey wasn't waiting. He was living. The final gift. That evening, Miller did something he hadn't done before. He took Bailey's collar, the one that had once belonged to James, and carefully removed the small worn dog tag that had hung from it. Then he walked to the base of the hill, where the villagers had built a simple stone marker in James's honor. Miller knelt, pressing the tag gently into the earth beside it. It didn't feel like letting go. It felt like completing something. Bailey stood beside him, watching quietly. And then, as if he understood, he sat down, not in mourning, not in waiting, but in peaceful remembrance. Miller smiled. "Come on, buddy. Let's go home." Bailey wagged his tail, and together, they walked away, not from the past, but toward whatever was waiting ahead. Because love doesn't fade. It moves forward. And some bonds, no matter how much time passes, are never truly broken. This ending brings closure while leaving the feeling of love and loyalty alive. Bailey is no longer waiting. He is carrying James's memory with him in a new way. Miller, too, has found peace, knowing that neither of them has to carry their grief alone. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.